I wanted to understand how humans lived prior to all our current technology. And I felt that was going to make me a better archaeologist to understand those things. And when I went to Alderleaf, there were some tribal elders that were associated with the school, and one of them had told me that his ancestors and that he himself could talk to trees. I was like, no, you can't. My scientific brain was wired, and I was like, you can't actually talk to a tree. He was like, yes, you can. I was like, all right, whatever. I just dismissed it. I didn't want to get in an argument with him. And as my journey continued on, I started having the spiritual awakening of being a naturalist and loving nature. I started to try and change my views, and I thought, you know what if I'm thinking of this wrong, and there is something to this? And I wanted to throw away my original beliefs and open up my mind more. And I said, okay, I'm going to try to talk to the trees. So every single day for a whole year, I sat underneath this cedar tree. It was a massive cedar tree in the middle of the woods, and it had a huge scar girdling the whole tree. And the scar was made by a cable, so I called it the cable tree. And this tree, what its purpose was, is at one point, it used to transport logs down this hill that were being chopped down. So I thought, oh, it's kind of morbid thinking that this thing was transporting all its family members down the hill. And so that started bringing a deeper connection for me. So every day I'd tell stories to it. I would bring food offerings to it. I would make fire for it. A couple of times I even camped underneath it, and I would constantly ask it questions. And every time I was expecting to hear verbal words in my ears telling me the answers to whatever I was asking. And it wasn't happening. And I started getting really frustrated. And I was like, you know what? That elder didn't know what he was talking about. This is not a thing. This is not real. And finally, we went on a field trip to the Olympic Peninsula. And when we were out there, there was this tribe called the Macaw tribe. And they had lived there for thousands of years, their ancestors. And a couple of hundred years ago, there was a landslide that covered the entire village there. And everyone was killed in a single instant that night. And everything they had, everything they were doing, all of it was trapped and frozen in a moment in time. And so archaeologists were digging this up and finding all these amazing artifacts and stories about the peoples, exactly how they were that moment, which was absolutely amazing. And from what I remember, it is the highest yielding archaeological site in the United States, with tens of thousands of artifacts being pulled out constantly. And I think they reburied it because they wanted to wait until better techniques for excavating had come out. Wow. And I think it's still reburied right now, so they haven't taken anything out yet. And I remember I was like, wow, I am an archaeologist, or an amateur at least, and I want to see some artifacts. It'd be so cool if when I go down here, I can find a stone tool. And so I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Pacific coast and seen what the shoreline looks like there, but it's very sharp rocks, and it's all dark basalt pretty much, and a lot of serpentinite and olivine that's very present there. And so it was a very distinct landscape. And the water was probably only about this deep that I was walking in, and I thought, if I'm lucky, I could find a fishing wave. And so I was just walking around the waters, and as I was doing that, my eyes were drawn to this really big granitic boulder, which was likely taken down from Canada when the glaciers were pulling things down south. And so, I don't know why, but I felt drawn to this boulder, and so I sat on it. And it was really warm to the touch. And when I was there, it was in the middle of winter, so the water was freezing cold, my body was cold, but this rock to the touch was so warm. It was very smooth and round, and it just felt right. So I sat on it. And I don't know what possessed me to this day, but I talked to the rock, and I said, hey, Mr. Boulder, you're a rock, I'm looking for stone tools, they're made of rocks, you know, you got a similarity. Can you help me out here? I want to find an artifact. And I was also like looking around, making sure no one was watching me, because I felt very silly doing this, because I didn't truly believe in it. And I hopped off the boulder, and I took 2 steps, and I reached in the water, and I pulled out something that I've been carrying around for so long. Now I gotta bury it, dig it out of this beautiful bag of goodies. So I pulled out this rock. And so I've been studying stone tools, and, and this just didn't look like anything I saw on the landscape. And I thought, whoa, there's this beautiful center line. It looks like it's tapered all around the edges. And my first thought was, wow, that looks like a handle. It's gotta be a hand axe. I was convinced I had just found a hand axe. And I remember I brought it back to my campsite, and I put it underneath my pillow, and I just slept with it for like 4 days under my pillow, just cradling this thing. And I will say, if I could redo this, I wouldn't have taken this, because you shouldn't take your artifacts. But I was not being a good archaeologist at the time. And I brought it back to the Burke Museum, and I went to the geology, not the geology department, the archaeological department. And I asked the lady there, I said, hey, did I find a hand axe? And she took one look at it, looked at me like, nope. I was like, no! I immediately felt the sudden urge to throw this rock out the window. I was so disappointed. And then she said, hold on, go to the geology department. She could clearly tell I was distressed here. And I was like, all right, fine. So I went over there, and the geologist was like, ooh, you have found something special. And I was like, is it a hand axe? She was like, no, I thought they told you that. I was like, I was hoping you had a second opinion. She's like, what you found is a basalt bomb. I was like, what is a basalt bomb? And she told me that when the Cascade Mountains were still erupting and they weren't extinct yet, that at some point lava had been shot out of one of those stratovolcanoes. And then while this was flying through the air, it partially cooled, landed in the water, and then instantly cooled, and just sat there for over 100 million years until I came by and picked it up.
Oh my God.
And I was just like, how rare are these? And she said, well, there's 3 types of basalt bombs that are really, that you're ever gonna really find out here. She said one is a splatter bomb, which looks like the Nickelodeon sign. And I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, but I don't want that. And then she's like, the other one's a ribbon bomb. I was like, ooh, what is that? She said, if you ever look at ribbon and how it kind of just curls in on itself when you like drop it on the floor, she said, that's what a ribbon bomb looks like. She said, but what you found was an almond basalt bomb, which is extremely rare. She said, I've been searching one my whole life and haven't found one. And then she offered me $300 for it. I was like, no way! I became so protective of it. And ever since then, I've just been hauling this rock around. And I had this thought later on in my life where I thought, did the rock talk to me? Did it actually answer my question? And for the longest time, there was a part of me, the scientific, literal mind, that was like, no, you just understood that this was not normal. You had been around so many rocks that you were able to pick out an anomaly in the water. And then the other half of it was like, no, that rock talked to you. Like that rock helped you out. And then I came to the point where I realized they're both right, and it doesn't really matter. It's whatever I want it to be, because it's my story. And so now I love telling that story to kids, because what I start trying to tell them is that the trees do talk to you, the birds talk to you, the tracks talk to you. It's you have to learn how to listen to them in their own way and interpret their story that they're trying to tell you. And ever since I allowed myself to see it that way, I was like, I can talk to everything. And I was like, this boulder's telling me it's got glacial striations, and it's telling me the past was all super icy, and there's probably a mile thickness of ice, and at some point this was just like a crater filled with little streams and rocks and soil and no trees. And or I'd see a tree that had multiple trunks coming out of one spot. And I was like, oh, at one point you got chopped down. Maybe it was from a fire or a lumberjack or something, but at one point you were cut. And I just started realizing there were so many stories flooding me, and I just was not listening. And so now every time I look around in nature, or I see someone's shoes and see like, oh, you got some mud on your shoes. You were walking through an area that was kind of wet. And so now it's just, there's stories everywhere. And so that definition that Webster and Oxford put out, it didn't fit my narrative anymore. It didn't make sense anymore. And so I had to, in my mind, change what it meant to understand what a storyteller is. And so, yeah, just some thoughts. What are some ideas of what a storyteller is to y'all?